First of all, my name is Helen Gavin. I'm based in the Environmental Change Institute of the University of Oxford, and I describe myself as a sustainability professional working across water, resources, energy, consultancy and academia. And I'm joined by Andrew Wright, Nick Eyre and Paul Massara. So I'm going to introduce them to you. Andrew Wright, give us a wave, Andrew. Andrew is an independent energy and regulation consultant and also professor in practice with the Durham University Energy Institute. Now, he worked at Ofgem, which is the gas and electricity regulator for Great Britain, over 2008 to 2018, including a 9-month period as interim chief executive. Before Ofgem, he was a senior equity research analyst covering UK and European utilities for a number of major investment banks. And then we'll hear from Nick Eyre. Nick, can you give us a wave, please? Thank you. Now, Nick is Professor of Energy and Climate Policy at the University of Oxford and Director of Energy Research for the university. His main research interests are the role of changing energy demand in the energy transition. And since 2018, he's been director of the Major Initiative on Energy Use, the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, or CREDS, as well as the Programme on Integrating Renewable Energy. And Nick was an expert contributor to the Oxford and the National Climate Change Assemblies, which have happened recently, and one of the lead authors on certain chapters in the 5th and 6th assessment of the IPCC. Last but not least, Paul Massara. Paul, can you give us a wave, please? Thank you. Paul is a member of the government's Committee on Fuel Poverty and a board advisor to Habitat Energy, which is an AI machine learning business on battery storage. He was CEO of npower from January 2013 to August 2015, plus country chair for RWE. Prior to this, he was the chief operating officer for npower over 2011 to 2012 and held other roles at Centrica and Genesis Capital Corporation. So I think I've spoken enough. So I'm going to hand over to our speakers now. Andrew, would you like to take the floor, please?
So as a way of kicking off this session and prompting debate, I'm going to start by setting out 5 important points that I think need addressing before thinking about what a post-COVID energy efficiency scheme might look like. First of all, I'm going to do what all people do, which is to reframe the problem. I think energy efficiency is too narrow a concept for the smart integrated zero carbon system of the future. We should start by thinking about what the overall goal of intervention in domestic energy should be, which in my mind should be to be able to deliver people's energy needs in a way that is sustainable, economically efficient and socially just. That means that any scheme will need to focus not only on energy efficiency, but also on flexibility and energy control. And we need to think of ways of integrating these measures and solutions with the wider energy system to deliver a reliable and affordable energy service in total. The second point, second message is that it almost goes without saying that we should insist on the highest standards for new build and also for deep refurbishment projects. The problem with this seemingly uncontroversial statement is getting some sort of agreement about what we mean by the highest standards when the goal is net zero. For example, it's not just about delivering the lowest possible levels of heat loss, particularly when you lose some flexibility by doing that. But it's also about heat sources, and it's also about whether or not we should be incorporating other factors such as storage, self-generation, and so on in the buildings as well. The third point is that many retrofit measures are uneconomic or impractical, and I think we need to think again about the approach to some of the more expensive and intrusive retrofit measures, such as solid wall heating and double glazing. Also, the job of converting heating from the more usual high temperature wet systems to those more suitable for heat pumps and electric heating is really difficult in most cases and intrusive in many cases. And just to be clear by this, by uneconomic, I mean that it may well be cheaper to invest in more low carbon energy supply, such as generation or heat production. When we think about this, this has all sorts of social and distributional challenges. It means that the benefits from any energy efficiency scheme may not be equally distributed or won't be equally distributed. And we need to find ways of making less energy efficiency houses a valuable part of the housing stock in a zero carbon world, and not creating inequalities in the slums of the future. The fourth point is that we need to sort out the distortive incentives and price signals that we need to do that urgently. That was very much a focus of the last few years of my time at Ofgem, and I could go on all day about this one, but it's enough to say that the policy costs and carbon signals are loaded very much on electricity, and none of those signals are loaded onto gas. And this puts genuinely zero carbon ready solutions, such as electric heat pumps, at a massive disadvantage to conventional gas heating, for example. More broadly, the inconsistency of carbon pricing throughout the energy system is a mess and needs to be addressed. Also, there's almost a complete absence of price signals at the domestic level to ensure efficient, flexible use of the energy system at a whole system level. For example, price signals for constraints on the local distribution networks. This is being dealt with by both government and by Ofgem, but needs to be addressed quickly and completely. And the final key message is that even if those price signals are addressed, some degree of intervention is essential, and not just for low income and vulnerable households. Undoubtedly, individual action in response to well designed price signals and incentives can do a lot of the heavy lifting, but in itself it isn't enough, in my view. And that's because there are so many barriers in the way to delivering the right solutions at the whole household level, and many of these are familiar. And an important point to make is these barriers exist just as much for flexibility and control as they do for more standard insulation measures. So access to low-cost capital, genuine risk and uncertainty about costs and benefits, a lack of awareness, knowledge and information, a whole host of behavioural factors, the fact that life gets in the way of doing these things, split incentives and distortions in the housing market. I could go on. So we definitely need that post-COVID scheme, even if we fix these incentives and price signals in the market. So what might that look like? Here are 5 thoughts about potential interventions. First of all, I think that any scheme that's proposed must have social justice and equity at the heart. Energy is an essential non-discretionary service. Affordable energy to meet basic needs is a right, or should be, in a civilized society. And the cost of energy is often a significant part of household budgets. Any scheme will involve significant costs and benefits, and inevitably those will be unevenly distributed. So any scheme needs to be designed with fairness, through the lens of fairness and justice. And this is not just a case of who pays and benefits, but also ensuring genuinely equitable access to the available measures, bearing in mind the barriers people face in the real world. Otherwise, I think there's a real risk that these types of schemes become a big middle class subsidy. There needs to be a genuine focus on outcomes rather than specific measures or technologies. Ideally, we'd be looking at moving towards a whole household or whole system even approach to put in place solutions. And previous energy schemes, even when they've been expressed and calibrated in terms of carbon savings, have generally been about encouraging specific measures. Ideally, so I think there's a real challenge for any short-term scheme, given this is fairly complicated to put in place, but we shouldn't lose sight of that goal, and we should be always working towards it. The third point is that we need to reform the governance of the institutions of the energy market. And we need to move away from the current supplier hub model, which is an oddity almost unique to the GB market. And until this happens, and I fear that licensed suppliers are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And just to be absolutely clear, this isn't a comment on the competence or the ethics of license-based suppliers. I think in many cases there are many successes we've seen from the current supplier delivery model, but end users are effectively forced to access the energy system using a licensed supplier as an intermediary, which is fundamentally restrictive, creates some potential conflicts of interest, and freezes out many more innovative business models. So I would prefer an approach that gives equal access to innovative business models, community-based ventures, and so on, with licensed suppliers or suppliers as part of the mix. I think the fourth point is, as I've said before, that householder and third-party capital can and should play an important part in delivering energy efficiencies at a household level. But the government's balance sheet is an essential enabler in this process. Previous schemes such as the Green Deal and CERT have suffered from labyrinthine attempts to keep the costs off the government's balance sheet. And in any case, such approaches are usually futile because the subsidy costs are recovered typically through energy bills, and the macroeconomic effect of this is very similar to taxpayer funding, but more regressive and more distortive incentives in the energy market. The government's rhetoric since the election suggests there's an appetite for using its balance sheet constructively where it's possible to demonstrate real long-term benefits. And if energy efficiency doesn't fit that criteria, I'm not sure what does. And the final point I want to make is that there needs to be a heavy focus on skills supply chain development, and probably one of the missing pieces of the jigsaw is methodologies. This is particularly the case if we broaden insulation, the scope of schemes from insulation to a more integrated range of measures. And this would require going beyond the skills of the traditional trades such as plumbers, electricians and heating engineers to a more integrated approach. Also, it's worth saying that generating bespoke solutions and designs at an individual household level is almost certainly uneconomic, so there need to be some sort of methodology that develops effective solutions in the vast majority of circumstances. So in conclusion, I think undoubtedly ambition, innovation and flair is going to be an important part of delivering energy efficiency as much as other factors, but within a framework of clear, consistent policy and sustained effort over a long period of time. I think the policy of a concept of a policy moonshot is unhelpful. I think it's both childish and dangerous, and that applies to energy efficiency as much as any other policy area. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Helen, and thank you, Andrew, for a great introduction. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is dig a bit deeper into the energy efficiency measures that are needed and appropriate in the UK housing stock, and particularly ask the question, does the need for a big pandemic recovery programme change the way that we should be thinking about it? So traditionally, our policy drivers for home energy efficiency have been the ones I list there, particularly in the UK, carbon emissions reduction and addressing fuel poverty. Some, but perhaps less emphasis on energy security, though energy efficiency has played a big role in improving our energy security. But clearly the need for a large macroeconomic stimulus, of which energy efficiency could be part, changes those policy drivers and gives more importance to economic growth, particularly to job creation and to some extent to what's called levelling up, i.e. Addressing economic growth and employment in specific locations where those are problematic. So the question is does that make a difference? And I think in a way it does. So this slide is a bit busy. It's taken from some work I was involved with that was led by my former colleague Jan Rosenau a couple of years ago, and it looks at what might need to be done in the UK housing stock up to the year 2035. So a sort of foreseeable 15-year program. And down the left, I've listed the major building fabric and heating measures that would be involved in improving our energy efficiency. Traditionally, we've looked at the right-hand column, thought about the energy saved and the carbon saved that follows from that. And I've highlighted there in green what are the most important measures in terms of energy saving. Cavity wall insulation, particularly deliverable in the short term, then in the longer term, solid wall insulation, the more expensive and difficult measure, and the move towards electric heat pumps away from gas-based systems, which obviously dominate the UK market at the moment. So that's been where the focus when you look at energy and carbon savings. The second column from the right looks at capital cost, and we've traditionally thought about cost as a negative. But perhaps that the nature of the macroeconomic recovery programme means that we should think about that more positively. If I delete cost and insert investment, then you might think that big numbers are good. And that slightly changes the picture. Solid wall insulation and heat pumps remain important, but a measure like double glazing might look significantly better on this. So that's slightly odd with what Andrew said, and we can doubtless discuss that. So there's some difference in the measures you might want to look at. Where I think there probably is not much of a change is in how we deliver those measures. We know quite a lot about how to deliver energy efficiency measures. As Andrew said, we haven't always done it very well, but I think we ought to have learned from our failures as well as our successes. This is my standard teaching graph for effective energy efficiency policy, and basically what it says is that as the market penetration of an innovative measure rises, you might need to think about different policy instruments, starting with support for innovation, but then a package of information, financial incentives, and training as the scale of the market increases, and then regulation to drive those late adopters, but also to give a clear signal to people that change has to happen. So that's a standard way of thinking about market transformation in energy efficiency research. It works. I mean, I've taken an example of an S-shaped curve from the adoption of condensing boilers in the UK, and you can see that in reality grants were applied for quite a long time, both government funded and then energy supplier funded. But the big takeoff in the number of units, the number of condensing boiler units installed, was when regulation was announced in 2003 with a large training program. And actually the takeoff began well before the regulation bit. The condensing boilers became mandatory in 2005, 2 years after the announcement. What you can see on the lower graph there is that rise in adoption significantly reduced the incremental cost of a condensing boiler. So that's the cost over and above the cost of a non-condensing boiler. And that incremental cost halved in that 5-year period from 1996 to 2001, simply because people were making more of them and people were installing more of them. Very familiar story, say, from the photovoltaics market as well. And now, of course, the incremental cost of a condensing boiler is probably negative in the UK because you can't install a non-condensing boiler in most cases. So the key policy message is there is no magic bullet here. There is no silver bullet. Regulation is probably important to give certainty, but actually you need to look at incentives, training as well, and think about those as a package. Now that's for individual measures, but if you look at the individual measures that are needed, and I've put the list there from the previous graph and added in other insulation like floor insulation and air tightness of buildings, which might be important as efficiency rises. There's a whole bunch of measures that we will need to do, and there's a question of, do you do them one at a time, or do you take a whole house approach and think about it as a package? And I think most people now agree that a whole house approach, whether that's doing measures at the same time or thinking about them, even if you're doing them consecutively, is going to be needed to ensure good energy performance in retrofitting buildings. But that requires higher levels of skills, as Andrew said, and probably some other policy innovations as well, using real-time performance data so we know what buildings are, how buildings are actually performing, and having some sort of building passport so we know what measures have been adopted in buildings. Currently, we often don't know what's been done in a building previously. A measure-by-measure approach, on the other hand, is problematic for deeper interventions. You need to think about particularly the interaction between the heating system and the building fabric to get optimum performance, but it can be delivered faster. So if we're thinking about programs for the next few months as part of an economic recovery package, we can probably do individual measures faster, particularly where there are specialist installers, for example, in heating, in glazing, people who will go in and just do one of those measures on the left-hand side. That's easier to organise and can be done faster. A rapid response for a COVID recovery package will probably need to rely to some extent, to a large extent, on a measure-by-measure approach, and that's what we're seeing coming out of government. But it's really important to do that in a way that prepares the ground for better future delivery options and thinking about whole house performance. So it's, I think, a nuanced answer to that question. What are the implications for policy? Well, as I've said, we need to be honest. In the UK, we don't have the skills base to start a massive whole house retrofit program this month. We just don't have that. But we do need to develop the capacity, the skills, and the pilot schemes to learn from to do that. And doing those things is urgent. But it doesn't mean we can't deliver bigger programs in some areas quickly. Our activity has been significantly scaled back since the Green Deal failure that Andrew alluded to in 2012. We're actually doing much less insulation work in the UK than we were a decade ago, which is scandalous, really. That will need, as I said, multiple policy interventions. We need to think of it not just as a 6-month grant program, but a long-term approach driven by some certainty provided by regulation, so people know that these measures are going to happen and there is a point in doing them sooner rather than later. And then, yeah, it's this stuff is nothing like a moonshot. This is about how people live in their homes. It's about how plumbers and electricians and gas fitters put in real equipment. It needs to be grounded. It is an Earthshot. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you very much, Nick. Paul, over to you.
Great, and welcome everybody. It's good to see so many people. I've got 82 people listed, which is amazing. I am a member of the Field Poverty Committee, which is a advisory group for BEIS, and so I just want to stress that the comments I'm making today are my personal comments. They may align with the Committee on Field Poverty, but they may not. So this is a personal capacity. So why now? Why actually did we think this question was important? I think there's almost universal acceptance that energy efficiency programs have got to be part of a Build Back Better program. It hits so many of the government's desired targets, creates jobs today, reduces CO2, reduces bills and fuel poverty, and it helps to balance society. And so that leveling up agenda that we're hearing lots about, I think, we can also make sure that this works. So look, we think it's really important. And I think what we're calling for now is a large multi-year program of energy efficiency as part of the autumn statement, the autumn spending review, which we expect to be in late October, early November. However, I think it's absolutely essential that, that while we're keen to create a big program, that we take lessons from previous programs to ensure that actually we deliver great outcomes. And like both of the previous speakers, I think the focus on moonshots is unhelpful. I think we have the technology, we have the basics, and this is about really delivering on the ground the nitty-gritty facts of what you have to do. Moonshots might be good PR, but actually this is about delivery on the ground, making a real difference for people. So I think it's important to look back at some of the previous programs, and there are underlying themes, I think, around certain things that haven't worked well or need to be addressed. So delivery mechanisms, and this is a continual challenge. Who is best to deliver these programs? And on the one hand, we have local actors who know the environment well, who know locations and buildings and people and the real issues on the ground. On the other hand, we want to have large programs which are delivered efficiently and which can be delivered at scale. And also there has to be quality control and there has to be redress if something goes wrong. And so I think there's a constant challenge around who is best to deliver these programs, even if we get the design of the programs correct. Then I would think the stability of the programs. What we've learned over many years is the stop-start position of funding is unhelpful. And so we need multi-year commitments so that we can get the skills and the training and the supply chains in place. And every time that we don't get that, we have a setback. And I think we would all look at the Green Deal and say there was a lot of hype around that, but actually the failure of that has left a bit of a tarnish over the industry and over future programs. And I have some concern that with the latest Green Home grants that's been announced of £2 billion, the fact that they're trying to launch this by September and it has to be installed by March is just very concerning. And it also doesn't give the supply chains or the skill base the length of certainty to invest in that. And that's super important for a whole set of reasons, not least of which actually is the quality of the work. So we need to ensure that we get high quality work and it's backed by some performance. The issue that we get is you have these funding peaks. A lot of people set up companies very quickly to take advantage of these grants, and then the quality of work may not be everything we want. If there's issues, then those companies simply collapse and they restart under a new name 2 months later. So I think in order to get it right, we need to have both the quality and we need to have some sort of bonded performance. And then we need to understand not only the physical changes that need to be made to the building, the fabrics, but also the behavioral issues that we're going to come across. So the fact is that, look, cavity wall insulation is cheap. We know that loft insulation is cheap, but actually, if you're going to clear a loft, you know, what does that mean? And what's the impact on the household? Solid walls is an efficient way of insulating, but actually, what does that mean in terms of redecorating the home or changing both the external viewing of the home? So all of these issues need to be taken into account. Then I would say search costs are becoming increasingly important because as we seek to target homes that need interventions the most, then clearly the finding costs have been creeping up. And so there is a real need to use better data and to use AI to reduce those finding costs. Now, the Digital Economy Act that was brought in, I think about 1.5 years ago, is enabling BAYS to work with DWP, take EPC data and other data to start getting a predictive model of those who are most needed in terms of fuel poverty. The Committee on Fuel Poverty recently did some work with Deloitte, which showed that just on ECO, which is a £640 million a year program, there could be hundreds of millions of pounds worth of savings by using AI. And then finally, I think there needs to be better governance and oversight. And we've seen this most recently with EcoFlex, where inside that 640 million, up to 20% of that is allowed to be delivered flexibly, and councils can set their own criteria. And in doing that, we have seen councils set the criteria from anywhere to 50 to 70,000 pounds as income per household, which in no definition is fuel poor. And so we need to balance how do we get that local delivery with flexibility. So what do we really need? Well, I actually think we need a Marshall Plan for energy efficiency, a large, long-term 10-year program for energy efficiency to give the supply chain certainty and to allow skills and to allow training. We need the better use of AI to identify and target homes, but not only to target homes, but also to target those homes where there may be behavioral issues. So in other words, if we can statistically look around why certain homes are being rejected for energy efficiency, then can we actually seek to overcome those issues and help? We need to use trusted parties who will be around in 10 years' time. And so that really does direct us towards suppliers and housing associations and councils. Another option or a linked option to that would actually be the possibility of auctioning off supplier obligations. So at the moment we require suppliers to fulfill their eco obligation and therefore they go and search for homes to try and put insulation in. But it may actually be more efficient to either have the DNOs or the suppliers essentially bid in to deliver the whole of the program. I think it's also important to see a greater alignment between not just cost and payback, but also the alignment with net zero. And so we need to see multiple measures being put in at the same time, and more of a whole house approach. And by that I mean, and you've seen that a bit through the greenhouse grant position, is that what we're having is a level 1 and a level 2 obligation, where level 1 might be energy efficiency and level 2 may be double glazing. And you can see that most with air source heat pumps, where there's no point in putting an air source heat pump in if actually you haven't insulated the rest of the home, because the savings that you get actually don't align very well. And I think there's also a need to take into account the carbon savings into the cost analysis. It is quite likely in the future, as electricity prices fall for a low marginal cost, as we have more fixed cost in the system, that essentially payback scenarios and payback methodology becomes less and less relevant. What is more likely to be important is if you look at the marginal carbon abatement curve and say, where does energy efficiency fit in against all of the other costs of getting to net zero? And I think if you start doing that, you end up with a very different sort of analysis of what makes sense. And then to build on some of the points that Nick was making, that actually once you make a decision and have certainty and you get scales of economy, you also see prices coming down very rapidly. We've seen that for solar panels and for offshore wind. That's going to apply exactly the same, I think, to batteries and to heat pumps. So government making clear policy and directing it and allowing those supply chains and scale to deliver also becomes self-fulfilling in the sense that it brings down prices. And then finally, I think we need to see more innovation for energy efficiency products. We're seeing UKRI pump a lot of money into research in many areas, but I think we've underinvested in new energy efficiency programs. And then finally, I think even if we get a big Marshall Plan, how do we ensure that we get a fair transition? And it's important that we target measures to those who are most in need and that the costs are paid by those most able to pay. At the moment, the supplier obligation means that those costs go on the bill, and it's very regressive versus putting those costs on taxation. And I think there's also a question of, do all households have access to the same new technology that can make such a difference? So whether that's heat pumps or batteries or EVs, if those rely on high upfront costs, are those most in field poor actually going to get the benefit of those? And then finally, I think there has to be a decision on how do we fund this? And although the government may well be looking to put money in at this stage, the question we should be saying is, how do we leverage that money? And who pays for that in different sectors? So I would say that under the private rented sector, people are running a business here, and therefore they should meet the cost of moving to Band C, and there needs to be suitable enforcement for that, including a mandatory registration of private rented sector. In the able to pay market, I think there should be some sort of incentivization, which could be basically either an extra council tax on inefficient homes or some sort of reduction in council tax for Band C and above. And then most importantly, perhaps in social housing, the cost of moving to a net zero home is probably £16,000 to £20,000. So for social housing, there's going to need to be some sort of part funded by government in order to get there. So look, this is a super important time to have this discussion. We're coming up to the spending review. Energy efficiency is going to be a major part of that, we hope. But let's get the detail right, and let's focus on an Earthshot, not a moonshot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have had a whole flurry of questions and comments coming in, so many thanks to Paul, Nick and Andrew for giving your presentations. And I'm now going to go through some of these questions and pose them to the panel. We've got 20 minutes, so hopefully we'll be able to get through them all, but here we go. Okay, now the first question is a very, very good one, which is, would a realistic carbon price, such as well above £100 per tonne, solve some of these problems?
Do you want me to start on that one?
Please go ahead.
Short answer is yes. You only need to look at the Bayes assumptions that the government's meant to be using in terms of carbon price and carbon values for use in policy interventions, to see that even before net zero came on board, prices above £100 a tonne were considered appropriate for policy interventions. If that's the way that's valued by government, then that needs to be reflected in the incentives in the market, whether that's through interventions or through market prices. I would probably say that recognise that we're looking at potentially long-term measures with 20, 25-year asset lives. So we need to be thinking in terms of the net present value of carbon savings. So carbon prices are lower today than they're expected, or carbon values, should I say, are lower today than they're expected to be 20 years in the future, as we're getting to the last stages of delivering net zero. Then that should be reflected in the incentives as well. So the question of how that's put through incentives in the marketplace is an important one, because obviously just slapping an enormous carbon price on gas would have enormous distributional effects and create enormous hardship in the short term. So I think there isn't a simple solution of just putting the carbon price in and letting rip. But undoubtedly, that such a high value of carbon should be reflected in all policy measures and interventions.
So my short answer, for the reasons Andrew just explained, my short answer would be no, which isn't to say that pricing carbon doesn't have some role to play, but to think that it's the solution, or even a major part of the solution, I think is actually unhelpful, not just for equity reasons, all those are very important, but actually all the other market failures that Andrew talked about, that Paul talked about, in delivering domestic energy efficiency, which are nothing to do with price. They're to do with the skills in the industry. They're to do with what people want to consider an investment. We know that the sort of economics 101 textbook approach to domestic energy efficiency is just unrealistic, and therefore yeah, getting the prices right, yeah, it helps, but it's far from the solution given the scale of the challenge that we've got.
Okay, Paul, would you like to comment on this question?
Yeah, just quickly. So I actually for a long time believe they should have a marginal carbon abatement curve for getting to net zero, and that would show you that at the front end of side there's things such as energy efficiency which are going to be miles better and are no-brainers really at this early stage. And as you'll see, as we get towards 2030, the cost of carbon effectively, or the cost of interventions to get to net zero, are going to rise dramatically. I don't think you need to put there's a difference between putting a price out there in the marketplace versus pricing it in essentially of your assumptions of what makes sense. So, I think putting £100 per tonne CO2 in your internal assumptions about what we should be going for makes a lot of sense now. That doesn't mean it's reflected in the market necessarily, but it just means that those are the products that we're going for. So look, I mean, I think it's going to be an important lens. If you spoke to Chris Stark at the Climate Change Committee, and I've had this debate, he would say, hey, look, the government are on the hook for net zero. They've got to spend as much as they have to get carbon down. So whatever the cost is going to be, you've just got to do the cheapest things. So yeah, I do think it's helpful.
Okay, thank you. So a bit of controversy on that one then, or difference of opinion. Let's jump to a question that reflects the fact that in this webinar we've been talking about the UK context. And so are there lessons we can learn from other programs in other countries? And the questioner has said that Japan has an excellent energy efficiency program called Top Runner, which sets the most energy efficient products as a baseline, for example. Nick, would you like to comment?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree. The Top Runner scheme is very effective. I think you can. I don't think it's hugely more effective than the EU approach. I mean, the EU is the place that has set the standards and labels that apply in the UK. until the 31st of December at least, and it's been a bit clunky as a process, largely the difficulty of getting 27 member states to agree with each other. That's been streamlined a bit in recent years, so I'm pretty optimistic that the EU standard setting process will be good in future. Don't want to raise a whole different debate, but I will just say it will be a great pity if the UK does not continue to stick with EU standards, and it's in nobody's interest for us to try to set up a separate process.
Okay, well, can I ask Paul and Andrew, can you comment, do you know if when setting out programs like the very recent Green Homes grant scheme that the government is rolling out, whether reference is made to other countries to try and find out what happened, what went well, and incorporate good points into UK policies?
If it's like other measures, then probably the answer is not enough reference is made to other countries. I don't know enough, I'm not close enough to the policy development to know whether that's actually the case in practice. And just to say on the previous question on the carbon price, I don't think the difference between the speakers was that great. I think all of us accept that explicit carbon pricing isn't a good idea. But higher carbon value should be reflected in policy development and interventions.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would say, I think historically they have looked at different programs. I mean, I think across the world, I think the issue becomes that the UK has got quite a unique position in some ways, which is the age of stock and how leaky it is, and the issues of where we are, and that is actually quite unusual versus a lot of other countries actually. And then I would say that right now there is with coronavirus and COVID, there's a real desire to create economic stimulus, and so therefore how much thought there's gone into the depth of those programs is probably less focused on that rather than creating jobs, quite frankly.
Okay, thank you. So the question here for Nick, which says, would it be correct to say that it's the volume that drives the cost down for new technologies? And if that's the case, why do we persist with incentives which drive plenty of interest, but then don't seem to lead to large volumes? Would it be better to actually implement legislation that would then hopefully deliver the long-term results and change that we want to see? I'm going to add in, like, the Scottish Government has proposed that all buildings must attain a certain EPC rating. I'll get to EPC ratings next. Either when the house is sold or on the point of a major change. We don't have that in England. Would that be a way forward, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think clear targets and clear legally binding targets have got to be part of the mix if we want to move forward at speed. But I don't agree with what's implicit in Paul's question, that incentives are an alternative. In my condensing boiler case, I think is relevant here. You can't just say we have no capacity at all in this sector and we are going to completely change it in 2 years. You have to. We know enough about innovation to know that you have to start, you have to build up capacity, you have to test things out, you have to accept a bit of failure. And build up some supply chain capacity, and incentives are a very good way of doing that. So incentives, yeah, in some cases have not been particularly successful, but in many cases the CERT program, the energy supply program, would delivered literally millions of efficient lights, literally millions of cavity wall and loft insulation jobs. So the incentives can deliver significant amounts of stuff and really gear you up to the point you can make things mandatory.
Okay, thank you. The question to all of the speakers, and it's about EPC or energy performance certificates. What is your view on these? Is the data really of any use? It's not an outcome measure. So, but that does seem to be the way in which individual buildings are rated in terms of their energy performance. What are your views on EPC?
So I would just say that I think there are a number of issues that are problematic with EPC, not least of all how they're kept up to date, whether there's an adequate record of them, what measures have been put in, how efficient those measures were put in. So I think there are, and how they're measured actually. So look, there's a lot that needs to be, I think, corrected on that. I mean, I really like the idea of a buildings passport, which sort of shows you what measures have been put in and upgrade it. But I think there has to be some real adjustments on both EPCs and the underlying, actually, and the SAP methodology as well, not least of all because they use various energy prices which don't make much sense, and the energy prices are distorted because of taxation being on the electricity bill and not the gas bill. So look, I think if we want to get better, and again to come back to data and AI and other things, we need to have much stronger sort of underlying core data, and so I think EPC can be improved for sure.
Helen, can I just add a quick commercial for my own research centre, and particularly my colleagues at University College London, who are working on how we can use smart meter data, real-time energy data, to develop an EPC in close to real time, one that will be based on actual data rather than a survey done in a couple of hours by somebody with, shall we say, a limited skill set, which is where we are at the moment.
I haven't got a huge amount to add, apart from just to reiterate the point I made about the real difficulties of deep retrofit. As you can probably see by the beams on my, I live in a very old house, which will never be highly energy efficient. You know, it would be a shame if such houses were lost to the housing stock, and we need to think carefully about the equity of a one-size-fits-all EPC system, particularly if it's backed up with penalties on rates, etc., etc., and that could introduce a lot of injustice in the approach. Given I can't remember the exact figures, but millions of our houses are more than 100 years old.
Yeah, just out of interest, Andrew, how old is your house roughly? Do you know?
350 years or so.
Okay, I was speaking to someone yesterday who said he grew up in a house that dated from 1246 or something, and I want to use this reference to longevity of our building stock. I'm going to pick up something that Nick said about reframing cost as an investment. Now, it's said that by 2050, the point at which we need to have net zero emissions in the UK, the existing buildings will be about 80% of the housing stock at that point. So you could argue that each person who's living in a property now is just a custodian of it. They might own it in terms of our, you know, kind of freehold or leasehold system, but essentially they will be passing it on to somebody else. Now, if that's the case, and we have a pucker house passport system, would any of you like to comment on the extent to which assistance should be made to make our buildings properly energy efficient, taking a whole systems approach, because they are essentially the country's assets for the future populations who might live in them?
I think,
Paul, how would you go?
Well, I think again, you know, I made reference in my sort of speech to sort of different sectors, and how I do think the government need to be funding part of this, that they've made a net zero obligation, and that's a legal commitment. But I think you have to look sector by sector to see if you want to get a fair transition. So I would say on the private rented sector, you're essentially running a small business or a large business, depending on how many houses you've got. And therefore, you know, there should be an obligation on you, I think, to make sure that the people living in there are living in energy efficient homes. Otherwise, the tenant ends up picking the bill. I think if you own your house, then the question is, you may well have capital tied up, but actually be fuel poor in the sense that your income, you're a retired person, may be low. And so what are the ways of releasing capital in buildings to allow that to happen? And then in social housing, you know, you're not able to pay in the sense from the tenant. And so how do you sort of bridge that? So I think there does need to be a range of both incentives and legislation, and the combination of those, and it has to be probably subtly different in each sector, to make sure that we apply it fairly in that transition.
Okay, Nick or Andrew, would you like to comment on my question?
I mean, just a sum, 30 million homes worth of order, on average £200,000 each. I think that's 6 trillion is the value of the, yeah, that's a big balance sheet against which to borrow if we can find out a way to do it.
Okay. I'm very conscious of time. I want to squeeze in 2 more questions before we need to say goodbye to everybody. One of the things coming out of the presentations is the need for a long-term plan and training, and to have organizations that can be trusted and will be around in 20 years' time. So there is a question about that says, I'm glad we're talking about whole house plans and the need for skills training and outcomes. Are there any plans for a national skills program and for the regulatory framework needed to measure outcomes against intent? Do any of you on the panel know what might be planning, what might be on the cards with regard to national skills training and outcomes?
The only thing I'd say is that a number of people have been lobbying as part of the spending review that not only obviously the energy efficiency side is important, but actually programs to gear up take time, and therefore if you're hitting a period where we could have mass unemployment, then actually the government doing something on skills training quickly will make a lot of sense, in the sense that you're going to have a long-term program as well. So I'm more hopeful than ever, just because of the environment that we're in, that essentially the government will be looking at this, because they know that jobs are important. They're also going to be looking at leveling up, and so again, how does that create jobs in those areas that need the economic boost the most? So I'm hopeful, but we need a long-term program.
I'll just add,
I have particular knowledge, but the only thing I would add is that it's not only about skills and training, but also about methodologies and toolkits. So actually having well-established methodologies for going into a house, assessing what measures could be implemented, and doing that in an integrated way, taking full account of flexibility, storage, generation, and other factors, is something that a lot of effort could be put into, and would enhance and supplement the skills that are being developed.
So I've just checked out who asked the question, and I think the answer, Liz, is that you probably know more about this than any of us on the panel. I would just repeat the point that in a lot of the built environment trades, the real driver for training is I will need to do it, and therefore regulation will be as big a driver of take-up of demand for training, and it's demand for training as well as supply of training that matters.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We've run out of time. I can't ask another question. So thank you everybody for joining us, for your very excellent questions and comments, and to the wonderful speakers, Andrew, Nick and Paul. Let us say goodbye and thank you by waving. So thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.